The guns went quiet. The missiles stopped flying. The world exhaled. Oil prices began to fall. Stock markets climbed back from the edge. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow ribbon of water that had been strangling 1/5 of the entire planet's oil supply for over 3 months, was finally about to reopen. Diplomats were shaking hands. World leaders were making statements. And for a brief moment, it genuinely felt like the worst was over. Then the streets of Tehran erupted. Not against America, not against Israel, not against Donald Trump or any foreign power. The people flooding the streets of Iran's capital were turning on their own government, on their own foreign minister, on their own parliament speaker, on the very men who had sat across the table and negotiated what was being called a historic peace agreement. They were chanting for their blood. They were calling them traitors. And that is the moment you need to understand, because that moment changes everything about what comes next. A deal can be signed. A ceremony can happen in Geneva on June 19th with flags and cameras and handshakes. But a deal that half of your own country's ruling establishment considers a national humiliation is not a deal. It is a time bomb with a very short fuse. And right now, that fuse is burning inside Iran in plain view of the entire world. This is the story of what actually happened, why it happened, who is behind the backlash, what it means for the deal itself, and why the world should be paying far more attention to what is unfolding inside Iran right now than to the celebrations happening outside of it. Let us start from the beginning, because to understand the rage, you need to understand the war. For 107 days, Iran and the United States were locked in a conflict that sent shockwaves through the global economy in a way that most modern conflicts simply have not. This was not a skirmish. This was not a few airstrikes and a press conference. This was a sustained military confrontation that gave Iran something it had never possessed before in any previous standoff with the West: genuine economic leverage over the entire world. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a body of water. It is arguably the single most important choke point on the surface of the planet. Roughly 20% of all the world's oil passes through that strait every single day. Countries from Japan to Germany to South Korea to India all depend on energy that flows through those waters. And during those 107 days of war, Iran made clear that it could and it would hold that supply hostage. The effect on global oil prices was immediate, dramatic, and deeply felt by ordinary people in dozens of countries who had no stake in the conflict itself. So when the deal was announced by President Donald Trump on Truth Social on a Sunday evening, the relief that spread across financial markets and governments worldwide was genuine, and it was enormous. The formal signing was set for June 19th in Switzerland, a neutral ground chosen deliberately. The agreement paved the way for the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. Shipping would resume. Oil would flow again. The bleeding of the global economy would stop. That was the story the world was being told. And on one level, it is true. But here is the part of the story that is not being told loudly enough. The moment that agreement was announced, something broke inside Iran. And not in the way that wars sometimes break a country outwardly. What broke was internal. What broke was the consensus inside Iran's own ruling class about what this war was for, what Iran sacrificed to fight it, and whether what they got in return was worth it. To understand the fury, you need to understand what the hardliners in Iran believed they had built over those 107 days. Iran's hardline camp, and particularly the circles loyal to Said Jalili, the former secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, had a very specific theory of the war. That theory was simple, and from a certain angle it was not entirely wrong. Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had demonstrated to the world that it possessed the military capacity to cut off 20% of global oil. That is not a small thing. No country in modern history had successfully weaponized that particular choke point to this degree for this long. And according to this camp, that leverage, that rare, hard-won strategic advantage, was the most powerful bargaining chip Iran had ever held in any negotiation with the West. Said Jalili is not some fringe figure. He's not a minor voice from the margins of Iranian politics. He spent years as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, and he became notorious in Western diplomatic circles for stalling talks deliberately, for refusing to make concessions, for viewing any agreement with the West as inherently a trap. He commanded enormous loyalty inside the Revolutionary Guards, inside the hardline media, inside the religious establishment circles that have always been the ideological spine of the Islamic Republic. And when this peace deal was announced, his camp looked at what Iran's negotiators had agreed to, and they reached a conclusion that is now driving the protests. Iran gave away its leverage without getting enough in return. That is the accusation being made in the streets of Tehran and in the corridors of power where Jalili's allies operate. Iran fought a war. Iran held the global economy hostage. Iran forced the most powerful country on earth to negotiate. And then, according to these hardliners, Iran's diplomats walked into those rooms in Islamabad and Geneva and traded all of that away for a deal that the hardline camp describes, in their own words, as a catastrophic capitulation. Those are not the words of a fringe minority. Those are the words of people who are deeply embedded in the institutions that are supposed to enforce the will of the Islamic Republic. And that is what makes this internal revolt so potentially dangerous for the deal itself. Now look at who exactly came out to protest. Because this is the detail that changes everything about how you read this story. The demonstrations that erupted in Tehran and in several other Iranian cities were not the kind of protests that most Westerners reflexively associate with Iran. These were not reformists. These were not young Iranians demanding freedom or better living conditions or an end to theocratic rule. These were the Islamic Republic's most loyal foot soldiers. These were IRGC loyals. These were hardline conservatives. These were the people who, in any previous moment of tension, would have been the ones cracking down on protesters, not the ones marching in the streets themselves. The demonstrations were organized and pointed. Protesters gathered in central squares in Tehran and chanted slogans against Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baqer Qalibaf, the two men who led Iran's side of the negotiations and who are now being accused by their own political family of making excessive concessions during talks with Washington. Think about what that means for a moment. Abbas Araghchi is not some reformist outsider who wandered into power. He is a career diplomat who has served the Islamic Republic for decades, and now the Republic's own hardline base is chanting against him in public. They are calling him names that in Iranian political culture carry the weight of accusations of treason. And Qalibaf, the parliament speaker who has his own long record of loyalty to the system, is being swept up in the same fury. The establishment is now being attacked by the establishment. And that kind of internal fracture is extraordinarily difficult to manage because the tools the Islamic Republic normally uses to suppress dissent, arrests, media blackouts, counter-mobilization, those tools were designed for use against opponents of the system. They were not designed to be turned against the system's own true believers. And then there is the question that is hanging over all of this like a thundercloud, the question of the supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei became the supreme leader of Iran following his father, and since being named to that position, he has not appeared in public. Not once in any visible, confirmed public capacity since assuming leadership. For a country where the supreme leader is supposed to be the ultimate source of authority on every significant decision, that absence is not just unusual, it is alarming. It is the kind of vacuum that political systems do not handle well, particularly when they are under enormous internal stress. And the hardliners are exploiting that vacuum deliberately and aggressively. Protesters and hardline commentators have begun making a claim that is designed to delegitimize the entire deal from within the system's own logic. Their argument is that no agreement with the United States of America can be valid without the explicit, visible public blessing of the supreme leader. They are not just opposing the deal on its merits. They are questioning whether the deal was even authorized by the one person in the Islamic Republic whose authorization would make it unquestionable. That is a nuclear argument in Iranian domestic politics. Because if the supreme leader's endorsement is absent or uncertain, then every official who signed off on this agreement is exposed. Every diplomat who made concessions can be accused of acting beyond their authority. And every provision of the deal can be called into question on the grounds that the man at the top of the hierarchy never truly sanctioned it. Foreign Minister Araghchi has been fighting back publicly and forcefully. He has appeared on state television and made the argument that Iran did not surrender. He has insisted that Iran emerged from this war stronger, not weaker. He has framed the deal as a diplomatic victory, arguing that Iran forced the United States to negotiate, that Iran demonstrated military capabilities that no one had fully credited before the war began, and that the deal reflects a new geopolitical reality in which Iran is treated as a serious power rather than a problem to be managed. To some extent, that argument has logic to it. Iran did force a negotiation. Iran did demonstrate leverage. And the fact that the United States agreed to sit down and sign an agreement at all is something that a decade ago would have seemed nearly impossible to imagine. In that narrow sense, the foreign minister is not entirely wrong. But here is the fundamental problem with that argument when you are making it to people who believed that Iran held the most powerful card in the game. The hardline camp does not dispute that Iran demonstrated strength. They dispute whether Iran cashed in that strength wisely. And their answer, right now, is a very loud and very organized no. The judiciary chief entered the conversation as well, calling for unity across all fronts, including the battlefield, the streets, the diplomatic arena, and the media. That appeal to unity is significant because it signals that the establishment is genuinely worried about how the internal divisions are being perceived. When a senior official starts calling for unity publicly, it usually means that the absence of unity is visible enough to be a problem. But here's the thing about calls for unity in a fractured system. They rarely work when the people being asked to unify believe they have been betrayed by the very leadership that is now asking them to fall in line. Now let us talk about the deal itself, because the domestic politics of Iran do not exist in isolation from the actual substance of what was agreed. The agreement, as announced, centers on two immediate things. First, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Second, the beginning of a 60-day window for nuclear negotiations designed to produce a more permanent settlement on Iran's nuclear program. Those two elements tell you a great deal about how this deal was structured and why the hardliners find it so objectionable. The reopening of the strait is the headline, but the details underneath that headline are sobering. The physical reopening of the waterway cannot happen the moment the ink dries on a document in Geneva. During 107 days of conflict, the strait was extensively mined. It was prepared as a battlefield. And returning it to commercial shipping is not simply a matter of declaring peace and waving ships through. The Pentagon's own internal estimates, according to the material available, place the full mine-sweeping operation at up to 6 months. Half a year of painstaking, dangerous, technically demanding work before the strait can be safely transited by the volume of commercial shipping that it normally handles every day. 6 months of mine clearing. 6 months during which global oil markets remain in a state of uncertainty. 6 months during which every tanker captain and every shipping insurance company is going to be watching nervously. The formal announcement buys relief in the short term, and that relief is real and it matters. But the physical reality on the water will take much longer to match the political reality on paper. And then there is the 60-day nuclear window. This is perhaps the most consequential element of the deal, and it is the one that has received the least attention in the global coverage of the agreement. Because what the 60-day window makes clear is that this deal is not a final resolution of anything. This deal is a ceasefire agreement with a framework for further talks attached to it. The core question, Iran's nuclear program, what it can enrich, to what levels, under what kind of inspection regime, with what kind of verification mechanisms, none of that has been resolved. All of that is supposed to be negotiated in the next 60 days. 60 days to resolve the question that has defined U.S.-Iranian relations for the better part of 3 decades. For the hardliners, this is not a sign of diplomatic sophistication. This is a sign that Iran's negotiators accepted a ceasefire that removed Iran's most powerful leverage, the closed strait, before the hard questions were even answered. They gave up the one thing that was costing the Americans and the global economy real pain, and they gave it up in exchange for a promise to talk more. That is how the hardline camp reads this deal. And in the language of negotiation theory, their critique is not entirely without basis. The strategic logic of leverage dictates that you do not give up your most powerful card before you have received what you actually want. You use that card as pressure during negotiations, not as a goodwill gesture before negotiations begin in earnest. The hardliners are arguing, loudly and with genuine anger, that Iran's diplomats violated that basic principle. And whether or not you agree with their conclusion about the war or about Iran's goals, the structural critique of the sequencing of this deal is worth taking seriously. Now, look at the broader picture for a moment, because what is unfolding inside Iran right now has consequences that extend far beyond Iranian domestic politics. The deal was brokered, at least in part, through negotiations in Islamabad, which signals Pakistan's continued emergence as a serious back-channel diplomatic actor in the region. The formal signing is set for Geneva. The American announcement came from Trump personally via Truth Social. Every element of this story's geography, Islamabad, Geneva, Truth Social, Tehran's central squares, tells you something about the fractured and genuinely unprecedented nature of the diplomatic moment we are in. And here's the question that nobody can fully answer right now. If the hardliners inside Iran succeed in generating enough pressure to force the leadership to walk back from the deal, or to demand renegotiation of terms, or to undermine implementation in ways that fall short of an outright cancellation, what happens next? The answer is not reassuring. If the deal falls apart, the Strait of Hormuz does not automatically become safe. The mines are still there regardless of what diplomats decide. The global oil market, which is already priced in the relief of the announcement, would face a brutal reversal. The military pressure that ended the shooting war does not vanish. And Iran, having demonstrated once that it could close the world's most important oil choke point, would have proven something very dangerous. That making and then breaking deals with the West carries no consequences severe enough to change the calculus. But there's another scenario that is equally important to understand. What if the deal holds, the signing happens in Geneva as planned, the mine sweeping begins, and the 60-day nuclear talks commence, but the hardliners inside Iran continue to wage their internal war against the men who signed it? Because that scenario, which is actually the most likely near-term outcome, does not produce stability either. It produces a government that is simultaneously trying to implement an agreement abroad while fighting for political survival at home. And governments fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously rarely perform well on either one. Said Jalili's camp does not simply want to oppose this deal from the outside. The deeper strategic goal, the one that is operating beneath the surface of these protests, is to position the hardline camp as the authentic voice of Islamic Republic values for whatever political moment comes next. If the deal works, they want to be on record as the people who warned it was a betrayal. If the deal fails, they want to be positioned as the people who were right all along. They are playing a political game that is entirely disconnected from whether Iran's population actually benefits from peace, and entirely focused on where power will land in the post-war internal rearrangement. That is what political actors do when a system is undergoing a transition. And Iran is absolutely undergoing a transition right now. The supreme leader question cannot be separated from any of this. Mojtaba Khamenei's invisibility since taking power is not a minor administrative detail. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic is not simply a head of state. He is the theological and political anchor of the entire system. Every significant decision, every major policy direction, every resolution of serious internal disputes, all of it flows through the supreme leader's authority in the Islamic Republic's governing structure. An invisible supreme leader in a moment of maximum internal pressure is not just a communications problem. It is a legitimacy crisis. Now, the hardliners are using that invisibility as a weapon. Every time they ask publicly whether the supreme leader actually approved this deal, they are not asking a genuine question. They know they are not going to get a direct answer. They are making an argument. They are planting doubt. They are creating the impression that the men who negotiated and signed this agreement may have acted without full authorization from the top. And in a system built on the principle that supreme authority flows from one specific office, that doubt is corrosive in a way that very few other arguments can match. If Mojtaba Khamenei were to appear publicly and explicitly endorse the deal, the hardliners' most powerful argument would collapse. The protest movement built around claiming the deal lacks supreme authority would lose its single most effective rhetorical weapon. But he has not appeared, and with every passing day that he remains invisible, the hardliners' argument gets slightly more powerful and slightly more difficult for the government to counter. Foreign Minister Araghchi and his defenders cannot simply say the supreme leader endorses this deal if the supreme leader does not appear to say so himself. State media can carry statements attributed to his office. Loyalists can speak on his behalf. But in a moment of deep distrust, attributed statements from invisible leaders carry limited weight against thousands of people who are willing to march in public squares and call the deal a surrender. There is also a human dimension to this story that often gets lost in the geopolitical analysis. Iran has just come through 107 days of war. Whatever the political calculations involved, whatever the strategic maneuvering that led to this conflict, the people of Iran experienced it as a real war. There were real shortages, real economic pain, real fear, real disruption to daily life in ways that go far beyond what any political analysis fully captures. And now, when a deal has been announced and the expectation of relief has been created, those same people are watching their own leadership fracture in public, watching the men who represent them on the world stage be called traitors by other men who claim to represent the same system, and trying to figure out what any of it means for their own lives. For ordinary Iranians who are exhausted and simply want the economic pain to end, this internal revolt is not a sign of the Islamic Republic's strength or resilience. It is a sign that the war damaged the system's internal coherence in ways that may take a very long time to repair. And it raises a genuine question about whether the implementation of this deal, which requires sustained political will and domestic stability over an extended period, is achievable in a system this divided against itself. Implementation is where every deal either proves its worth or reveals its weakness. The signing ceremony in Geneva, if it happens on schedule, will be a powerful image for global consumption. But images do not sweep minds. Images do not resolve nuclear disputes in 60 days. Images do not bridge the gap between a foreign minister who says Iran won and a generation of hardline loyalists who believe Iran surrendered. The post-war period in Iran is going to be defined not by what was agreed in Switzerland, but by what happens in the weeks and months after. Whether the hardliners can be brought into a political settlement with the government's diplomatic direction. Whether the supreme leader becomes visible and uses that visibility to impose coherence on the system's internal debate. Whether the 60-day nuclear talks produce anything that the hardline camp can accept without calling it another capitulation. And whether the physical process of mine clearing and strait normalization proceeds smoothly enough that the economic relief promised by this deal actually materializes in time to change the public mood. None of those things are guaranteed. Not a single one. And here is the final truth that ties all of this together. The argument being made by the hardliners that Iran gave away its most powerful card before the hard questions were answered is an argument about sequencing and leverage. And the argument being made by the government that Iran demonstrated strategic capability and emerged with its dignity intact is an argument about framing and narrative. Both of those arguments can be simultaneously true Iran may well have demonstrated real strength and simultaneously made a strategic sequencing error. History is full of examples of nations that won battles and lost negotiations, and the men fighting over that interpretation right now are not fighting for clarity, they are fighting for power. The war between Iran and America may be over. The quiet that has settled over the Strait of Hormuz may hold long enough for the ships to pass through again. The ceremony in Geneva may happen exactly as planned on June 19th, with all the flags and cameras and careful handshakes that such moments require. But inside Iran, in the central squares of Tehran, in the corridors where Said Jalili's allies meet, in the state television studios where a foreign minister is fighting for his reputation, and in whatever room or building or location the invisible supreme leader currently occupies, a different war is raging. It has no missile strikes and no naval blockades, but it has everything else that makes a conflict dangerous: competing visions, genuine fury, institutional power struggles, and a complete absence of the kind of authoritative leadership that could bring it to a clean resolution. The global peace deal is the headline. But the story underneath the headline, the story of what is happening inside Iran right now, is the story that will determine whether that headline means anything at all 6 months from now. A foreign minister called a traitor by his own people, a supreme leader who has not been seen, hardliners who gave their loyalty to a system and now feel that system betrayed them, and a deal built on 60 days of nuclear talks that nobody has yet explained how to resolve in any timeline, let alone that one. Watch Geneva on June 19th if you want to see the ceremony. But keep your eyes on Tehran, because what happens there in the coming weeks is going to tell you everything the ceremony cannot. There is a pattern in modern history that deserves attention here, because Iran in this moment is not without precedent. When large, complex authoritarian systems sign agreements under military and economic pressure, the internal fractures that follow are almost always more dangerous than the external conflict that preceded them. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of American military pressure. It collapsed because of what happened inside. Iraq's Ba'athist system did not fail on the battlefield alone. It failed because of what decades of internal contradiction had done to its coherence long before the first bomb fell. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not those systems, and this moment is not that moment. But the structural warning embedded in that pattern is worth hearing clearly. External agreements do not heal internal wounds. They frequently deepen them. What Iran is experiencing right now is something that political scientists call a legitimacy stress fracture. It is not a revolution. It is not a coup. It is not even necessarily a crisis in the immediate sense. It is a moment where the internal logic of a system begins to contradict itself in ways that are visible to everyone inside and outside simultaneously. The Islamic Republic was built on a very specific set of ideas: resistance to the West, rejection of compromise with America, the principle that Iran's sovereignty and dignity were non-negotiable. Those ideas are not simply propaganda. They are the genuine ideological DNA of millions of people who built careers, families, and identities around the system those ideas produced. When the men at the top of that system sign an agreement with Washington, those millions of people do not simply update their beliefs because a ceremony happened in Switzerland. They ask whether the men who led them have abandoned the principles that defined everything. And when no visible authority figure at the very top of the system steps forward to reframe the deal in terms that make sense within that ideology, the vacuum fills with fury. That is not irrational. That is how belief systems respond to perceived betrayal by their own institutions. Said Jalili understands this dynamic better than almost anyone in Iranian politics. He has spent decades operating in the space where ideology and institutional power intersect inside the Islamic Republic. His refusal to make nuclear concessions during earlier rounds of negotiations was never purely strategic. It was partly a performance for a domestic audience that needed to see its leadership hold the line against the West, regardless of the cost. He built his political identity on that performance. And now, when Iran's current leadership has done precisely what he spent years refusing to do, his political identity demands that he oppose it, not because he necessarily has a better plan, but because agreeing with it would erase the thing that makes him powerful. This is the hidden engine beneath the protests. It is not simply principled disagreement about the terms of a peace deal. It is a power struggle dressed in the language of ideology. And the reason it is so difficult for the government to counter is that the ideology being invoked is the same ideology the government itself claims to uphold. You cannot easily call someone a traitor to the revolution when they are quoting the revolution's own founding principles back at you. The 60-day nuclear negotiation window is where all of these pressures are going to converge at once, because within those 60 days, Iran's government will need to make decisions that are going to be extraordinarily difficult to justify to the hardline camp, regardless of what those decisions are. If Iran's negotiators accept strict limits on enrichment and robust verification mechanisms, the hardliners will call it a complete surrender of Iran's sovereign right to a nuclear program. If Iran's negotiators hold the line and the talks collapse, the ceasefire itself comes under pressure and the entire relief the deal was supposed to deliver evaporates. There is no outcome in those 60 days that easily satisfies both the diplomatic requirements of a sustainable agreement and the ideological requirements of the hardline camp back home. That is not a negotiating problem that skill and experience can fully solve. That is a structural contradiction, and structural contradictions in international agreements have a very specific historical track record. They produce either a system-level shift in the domestic politics of one party, meaning the hardliners lose enough power that their opposition becomes manageable, or they produce the slow death of the agreement through non-implementation, delay, and incremental undermining that never quite crosses the line of formal cancellation, but renders the deal meaningless in practice. The global community, and particularly Washington, needs to understand which of those two paths Iran is heading down right now, because the response to each path is completely different. If the hardliners are noisy but ultimately contained, the right approach is to give Iran's government the diplomatic space and the economic incentives it needs to consolidate support for the deal domestically. If the hardliners are actually winning the internal argument and the government is being forced to retreat, then the deal's implementation timeline needs to be understood as unreliable from the start, and contingency planning for a breakdown matters far more than celebrating the signing ceremony. Right now, from the outside, it is genuinely impossible to know which scenario is unfolding. And that uncertainty itself is a significant problem because markets, shipping companies, insurers, and governments around the world are making decisions based on the assumption that the deal holds. Every tanker rerouting back toward the Strait of Hormuz, every oil contract written at post-announcement prices, every government that has publicly credited the agreement as a diplomatic achievement is now carrying a quiet exposure to what is happening in Tehran's streets and in the hardliners' political meetings. This is also a test of something larger than Iran. It is a test of whether deals made under the specific conditions of this conflict, meaning a short, intense war with maximum economic leverage on one side and maximum military capability on the other, can actually survive contact with the internal politics of the countries that sign them. Because if Iran's peace agreement fractures from within, despite the enormous external pressure that produced it, it sends a signal to every government in the world that is currently calculating whether negotiated settlements are worth pursuing. That the hardest part of ending a war is not stopping the shooting. The hardest part is surviving the peace at home. Iran ended a war, but it has not yet survived the peace. And until the day comes when a visible supreme leader stands before the Iranian people and frames this agreement in language that the system's own loyalists can accept, until the day when Said Jalili's camp either wins the internal argument or loses it decisively, until the minesweeping is complete and the oil is flowing, and the 60 days have produced something real, none of the relief that the world felt when the guns went quiet is fully earned. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen. That much, at this point, seems likely. But the question that matters most right now is not whether ships will pass through that strait again. It is whether the country that closed it will hold together long enough to keep it open. And on that question, the streets of Tehran are sending a warning that the world should not mistake for noise.